One of the famous superheroes that I can relate to is Spider-Man. Because just like Peter Parker, in high school, I wasn't very athletic. Just like Peter Parker, I wasn't very popular. And just like Peter Parker, I was kind of a nerd. Now, we're all kind of familiar with Spider-Man's origin story. And if you're not very familiar with his origin story, I recommend that you watch the first Spider-Man from 2002. It's a great movie, so if you haven't watched it yet, I give you permission to just turn off this video now, go online, Disney Plus, and go ahead and watch that movie, and then you can continue watching this video. But even if you haven't seen the movie before, most people know how Spider-Man became Spider-Man. Right? He was bitten by a radioactive spider, he gets all these cool superpowers, and then he becomes one of the most famous superheroes of all time. And obviously, being a superhero, you fight many villains. And one of the most famous villains that Spider-Man fights is the Green Goblin. Now, unlike Spider-Man, we don't really think about the origin stories of villains like the Green Goblin. We don't really know, or we're not too familiar with other villains like Lex Luthor or the Joker. We don't really think about their origin stories. And the other thing that we don't really think about is how today's culture seems like they just make villains as if they're plain evil. Like they were just evil their entire life. But if you think about it, the way that comic books depict people like the Green Goblin, it's like as if they've been evil their entire life. So they're an evil person, an abnormal evil person that just becomes evil with superpowers. And we just tend to think to ourselves, there's no way. There's no way I can become a super villain like that. I mean, I don't want to conquer the universe. I don't want to rule people all over the world. And I don't want to start mass destruction everywhere. I mean, that's just too much work. Because the reality is, it's not that an abnormal person becomes a villain. It's just a normal person just like you and me, we can become a villain. And we don't even know it. We might not even know it if we were to turn into a villain. And one of the most famous villains that we're going to look at today is from the Bible is Pontius Pilate. Even if you haven't been to church before, Pontius Pilate is the governor of the Roman Empire of the province of Judea. And the Roman Empire was the most powerful empire in the history of the world. Now, the role of the governor at the time was to make sure that all the people in their province paid their taxes and that they kept everything peaceful in their province. But Pilate isn't known for being a good governor. He's not known for being smart or keeping the peace. Actually, what Pilate is most famous for is this verse you can see in this verse in the Bible from John. Then Pilate turned Jesus over to them to be crucified. So whenever people hear the name Pilate, this is what they think about. They think about the man who turned Jesus over to the crowd. They think of the man who ordered his soldiers to torture, punish, and then ultimately kill Jesus. That is his reputation. But what most people don't think about is that Pilate had a few major opportunities to stop that from happening and to stop the religious people from taking Jesus and killing him on the cross. Because like Pastor Caesar said in episode 1, people don't grow up and strive or dream to become a villain. Like I said earlier, like some of us become a villain and we don't even know it. That's what happened to Pilate. Now, if you haven't seen our episode or episode 1 of any of our previous episodes, you can just go online to wearegracepoint.com and you can catch up there if you like. And I recommend doing that so that you can get up to date as we continue today. Now, for us to understand how Pilate became and how he got that reputation, we're going to have to look into Scripture and we're going to have to look at two different accounts. The first account that we're going to look at is from a man named John. And John was one of Jesus' most closest friends. He's the friend that if you were to ask him, Jesus asked John before he went up to the cross to please take care of his mom. Now imagine someone in your life that you are so close to that you would let them take care of your mom. That is who John is to Jesus. The other perspective that we're going to take a look at is from a man named Luke. Luke was a doctor. He was educated, and his goal was to give the most accurate account, the account with the most details of the life of Jesus. In the beginning of his book, Luke actually says, "Having carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I also have decided to write an accurate account for you." That's what he says in the beginning of his book. You see, Luke's account was more about the details and the facts, whereas John's account was more about the heart. So in order for us to understand how Pilate got to this point where he turned Jesus over to the religious leaders, we have to look at those two different accounts. We're going to start in Luke's account. It says here in Luke 23:1, "Then the entire council took Jesus to Pilate, the Roman governor." Now where it says entire council, Luke is referring to the Jewish leaders at the time, the priests, the teachers, and the religious teachers of the law. And so you might think to yourself, what is the big deal? Like, aren't these the good guys, the religious leaders? They sound like they're heroes, right? The problem was, these religious leaders, they were too focused on having people or making people following the law and enforcing their law, rather than teaching them how to build a relationship with Jesus. You see, it's like, imagine that you're having dinner with someone that you're trying to connect with, that you're trying to build a relationship with. So you sit down and there's candles in front of you and the lights dim around you. There's a lot of people around you because it's a nice restaurant. So you sit down and then the waiter comes to you, right? And in your mind, you're like, okay, I get to know this person. But the waiter comes to you and he asks, before you talk to each other, you have to finish the bread. You have to finish the bread first, and then after the bread, then you can start talking to each other. Okay, that's kind of weird. But then he continues, and then he says, but before you get to the main course, you have to make sure that you say 3 interesting things to each other. Otherwise, we won't give you the main course. And then he says, okay, when you get to the main course, you only have 7 minutes to finish that main course. Otherwise, you won't get dessert. These are the religious leaders. Religious leaders are like that waiter. They were too focused on laws. They were too strict on what they were trying to enforce, rather than trying to help people connect and build a relationship with Jesus. We continue, and it says in verse 2, "They, the religious leaders, began to state their case. 'This man, Jesus, has been leading our people astray by telling them not to pay their taxes to the Roman government and by claiming he is the Messiah, a king.'" So the religious leaders are telling Pilate, hey, Jesus is telling us not to pay the taxes to the government, to the Roman government. And that was just plain wrong. Jesus wasn't telling people to do that, or telling people not to pay their taxes. Jesus wasn't doing that. And they're saying that Jesus was claiming that he was a king, that he was the Messiah. And, in a way that was true. Jesus was saying that he was a king, but not in the sense that the religious leaders believed, because Jesus was saying that he had a kingdom, but the kingdom was not here on earth. So, as we continue the story, now we're going to take a look at the second account that I talked about, which is John's account. And this is what it says in chapter 18, verse 31. "And take him away and judge him by your own law," Pilate told them. The religious leaders respond, only the Romans are permitted to execute someone. Because Pilate is saying here, why don't you just deal with him? I don't want to deal with him right now. You deal with him. He's breaking the laws that you guys have set. Why don't you deal with him? But the religious leaders, they're saying, Pilate, you're the one with the power, the authority, and the responsibility to take care and make sure that everybody is following the law in this province of Judea. But the problem was, for Pilate, was that the Roman law actually had the power to override the Jewish religious laws. You see, the Jewish religious laws, they could enforce those laws, but only the Roman law had the power to use the death penalty. So then, Pilate takes Jesus into his headquarters. And this is what his headquarters might look like. It's kind of like, you can think of it as his courtroom. So Pilate talks to Jesus, and this is the first chance that Pilate has to let Jesus go as an innocent man. And it says, Pilate turned to the leading priests and to the crowd and said, I find nothing wrong with this man. But instead of letting Jesus go, instead of letting him go as an innocent man, Pilate ends up doing nothing. The religious leaders and this crowd start getting on him, right? They start screaming at him, yelling at him, and saying, you got to do something about this man. So Pilate starts feeling the pressure. And it says in verse 5, you can see, then they became insistent, the religious leaders, because he is causing riots by teaching wherever he goes, all over Judea, from Galilee to Jerusalem. So Pilate's there, and he's feeling all of this pressure from people all around him. Now, you can imagine yourself, let's say, like you're at a casino with your friends, and you're dealing one good hand after the other. You're making a lot of money, but you know that you're kind of in debt, so you have to be careful with your money. And then your friends tell you, okay, go ahead and gamble another $4,000, another $7,000. Go ahead and put it in. You'll make it up later. But you're in debt. These people are telling you what you should do, but you know what the right thing to do is. Or let's say, you're out late at night with your friends, just having a good time. And your friends are like, okay, I'm having the munchies right now, so why don't we get some Krispy Kreme donuts? Right? But you're on a diet, and you know that the right thing to do isn't to have any donuts. But your friends are telling you, and they're like, these donuts won't eat themselves. And I know, all of this sounds kind of ridiculous. But we've all been in that place before, where we're afraid of feeling embarrassed. We're afraid of being isolated, or we're afraid of being called out by the crowd. We don't want any conflict. We've all been in that place before. You know what you should do, and everybody around you is trying to convince you of something that you shouldn't do. So the religious leaders, they're just going crazy at Pilate. Like I said, they're arguing and yelling at him. But then Pilate sees a chance for him to get out. It says in verse 6, oh, is he a Galilean? Pilate asked. You see, the governors, like I said earlier, they were responsible for taking care of their own provinces. They have specific jurisdictions, like law enforcement today, right? They have their specific jurisdictions that they can work within. So Pilate tried to give his case over to the governor of Galilee because the religious leaders just said that Jesus is a Galilean, right? So Pilate had a plan. Let me give over Jesus to my best friend, who is the governor of Galilee, Herod Antipas. If he could pass it on to his best friend Herod, he wouldn't have to deal with this situation anymore, right? So it says in verse 7, Pilate sent him to Herod Antipas because Galilee was under Herod's jurisdiction. So Pilate sends Jesus over. and Herod is questioning him. And what happens? Jesus doesn't answer any of Herod's questions. So in verse 11 it says, "Then Herod and his soldiers began mocking and ridiculing Jesus. Finally they put a royal robe on him and sent him back to Pilate." Okay, so Pilate sends Jesus to Herod, his best friend. And then Herod ends up just mocking and ridiculing Jesus. Think of it kind of this way. But before I continue, I want to make sure that you know that I'm speaking only hypothetically. Okay? Imagine that you're you're starting to build a connection with someone at work. Or it could be someone in your class. Right? You start building a connection, you start sharing stories with each other, and you start having a good time at work. And over time, it seems like your connection is growing deeper. So much so, to the point where you actually start looking forward to going to work. And not because you're looking forward to doing work, because who looks forward to going to work? Okay, maybe some people do, but you're not going to work because you're looking forward to the work. You're going to work to see them, and you get to spend time with them. But then, you find out she's married. So you go to your best friend. You ask them, hey man, there's this girl at work, and I feel like we're starting to build this chemistry. We're starting to build this connection. Right? People nowadays, they want chemistry. They want connection. But then I found out he's married. So then your best friend, if he's actual best friend, he tells you, Jeff, don't be stupid. Remember, this is not a true story. It's just an example. But he says, Jeff, don't be an idiot. Don't do something stupid. Don't be a homewrecker, man. So your friend starts giving you a hard time. He starts mocking you and ridiculing you because it's obvious to him what the answer is. It's obvious to him that you shouldn't do anything with this girl, Jeff. And it's like Pilate and Herod. Herod is like, it's obvious this man, Jesus, is innocent. Pilate, you know what the right thing to do is. So then comes Pilate's second chance to release Jesus as an innocent man, right? Here's another opportunity for him to do that. Then Pilate called together the leading priests and other religious leaders along with the people, and he announced his verdict. You brought this man to me, accusing him of leading a revolt. I have examined him thoroughly and this point in your presence and find him innocent. So Pilate calls them all together and he says, guys, I don't find anything wrong with Jesus. He's an innocent man. But then look what Pilate decides to do. He says, so I will have him flogged and release him. Pilate is saying, I can see Jesus, this man is innocent. And my best friend sees that he's innocent. But I can't seem to please this crowd, these religious leaders and these crowds, they're just all over this case. They won't leave me alone. So what do we do? What do we tend to do when it seems like we can't agree with someone, when we can't seem to come to an agreement with someone? We start to compromise. And in this case, Pilate thinks that he can compromise. The way of him to compromise is to beat Jesus up, torture him, and punish him so close to death. Not quite killing him, but torture him so close to death. Because he's thinking, okay, if I can torture him, if I can just make him suffer just enough, maybe then that will make these religious leaders happy. I would get them off my back. But not only does Pilate think that he should torture Jesus, Pilate also offers to release a criminal named Barabbas. Barabbas is a true criminal, and he was in prison. And the reason why Barabbas was in prison is because he was guilty of rebelling against the Roman government, and he was guilty of murder. Think about it. You can think of Barabbas as, if he were here today, he would be the same as the person, as, let's say, the country's most wanted, or like a person who was a mass shooter, someone who shot up a school or shot up a church, right? That is who Barabbas was. So Pilate's thinking, okay, there's no way that this crowd would choose to release Barabbas, this criminal, this guilty criminal, instead of Jesus, who's done nothing wrong. So Pilate's thinking, this is a brilliant plan, right? So here's the third opportunity for Pilate to release Jesus. And it says, then a mighty roar rose from the crowd, and with one voice they shouted, "Kill him and release Barabbas to us." Pilate's plan to compromise backfires. His brilliant plan failed. So instead of releasing Jesus, Pilate had Jesus flogged with a lead-tipped whip. The soldiers wove a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and they put a purple robe on him. At this point, Pilate has completely lost control of the situation. Matthew, who also witnessed all of this, wrote, Pilate saw that he wasn't getting anywhere and that a riot was developing. So he sent for a bowl of water and washed his hands before the crowd, saying, "I am innocent of this man's blood. The responsibility is yours." So he washes his hands and he hands Jesus off to the crowd. And on top of that, Pilate ends up releasing Barabbas, and in John 19:16, then Pilate turned Jesus over to them to be crucified. So in the end, Pilate ends up not doing anything with Jesus. Jesus ends up where he started, in the hands of the religious leaders. And what's even worse is that Jesus gets tortured and this criminal Barabbas gets released. But like we've been seeing, Pilate had more than one opportunity to release Jesus as an innocent man. But he ends up doing nothing. And there's a saying, and maybe you've heard it before, that goes, "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing." Pilate became one of the most famous villains of the Bible. But what he didn't know, was that his choices here would change his legacy for thousands of years to come. Because like Pilate, you and I rarely have one opportunity to do the right thing in a situation. Because from the beginning, remember when Pilate first saw the religious leaders and he didn't release Jesus, Pilate thought that the easy thing for him to do was to follow the crowd rather than doing the right thing. Because just like you and me, he felt like he had less of a chance to being embarrassed or being rejected, or feeling like he didn't belong if he just followed the crowd. And then the other thing that we saw during this story was that Pilate thought that he could get away with doing the easy thing and let someone else do the right thing. That was with his best friend Herod. He thought that he could do the easy thing by giving Jesus over to Herod and make Herod do the right thing. And what we also saw when Pilate was trying to release Barabbas and he tortures Jesus, Pilate thought that the easy thing to do is to compromise in order to avoid doing the right thing. And through all of that, through the entire story, what we can see, what we can learn is the more you choose to do the easy thing, the harder it will be to do the right thing. And don't get me wrong, doing the right thing is extremely difficult. It's not black and white, and it can be one of the hardest things to do. It's especially hard to resist doing the easy thing because we're afraid. We can be afraid of being embarrassed. We can be afraid of being insecure or feeling insecure. We're afraid of ruining our reputation. Or we dread the idea that if we do the right thing, we might end up being alone. We might end up feeling like we don't belong. Because, like I said, doing the right thing isn't always black and white. But here's the thing. When we make the decision to follow Jesus, and we make the decision to trust Him, He will lead us to do the right thing. Because you usually regret doing the easy thing, but you never regret doing the right thing. There's a verse in Galatians that says, "So let's not get tired of doing what is good. At just the right time, we will reap a harvest of blessing if we don't give up. Therefore, whenever we have the opportunity, we should do good to everyone, especially to those in the family of faith." Because here's the thing. We only see a small thing. We only see a small part of what Jesus sees. Right? Jesus sees the big picture. He sees everything. And Jesus might not take away all of the struggle and all of the pain and all of the consequences that come with doing the right thing. But here's what's for sure. Jesus promises that following Him will bring you redemption. There will never be a moment in a situation where we can disappoint Jesus. There's nothing that we can do, that there's nothing that we won't do that will disappoint. We can never be disappointed in these situations where it feels like it's so difficult to choose the easy thing or doing the right thing. We can never disappoint. And the other thing is, He will be with us through it all. He will be with us through the entire situation. There is not a moment He won't be there. Because He's there even if we don't feel like it. Through all the choices that we face in life, through all the decisions that we have to make, He, Jesus, is always right beside us.
Thank you for joining us for this week's message. Gracepoint Church is located in South San Francisco, California. For additional content or to find out more information about Gracepoint Church, visit us online at wearegracepoint.com.